My name is Patrick Chong, and I'm starting this YouTube channel as a means to document my journey in terms of coding. From having not read for a degree in computer science and having had no background in coding, I thought a lot of people would share this journey and find it interesting to follow along. And perhaps many of you out there are doing the same thing, sort of having a full-time career, not in software engineering or related to coding at all, just like myself, and would find this very insightful in terms of joining a software engineering company, job, or even just doing it as a hobby, as I am. So the purpose of this channel will be to document sort of that journey, but I've always been very keen in teaching. So at university, I used to tutor high school students in A levels and also for GCSE, and I found it quite rewarding, not from a financial perspective, but just teaching and sort of passing on that knowledge. I've found it very, very sort of satisfying in doing that. So in this YouTube channel, as well as documenting my journey sort of in terms of where I started off roughly a year ago, knowing no coding whatsoever, to sort of taking it very seriously very early on, to today, sort of a year later, and where I've got to. So as well as documenting that journey, I would also like to put out a number of teaching videos, so covering some of the main contents of Python. So Python is the programming language that I code in, and there's many out there, but it's the one that's most popular at the moment, closely followed by Java. So as well as documenting my journey from sort of knowing no Python to where I am today and sort of where I'm going in the future, I will also be putting out videos covering the fundamentals of Python for people who want to get started in Python, where you should start, and where I started, and sort of what I found most useful in the beginning, to save you guys some time sort of digging around looking for resources. I know that starting up and having no coding background, it can be quite challenging in terms of thinking about where to start. And sure, you can look up things here and there, but sort of to get an understanding of where to go and what you want to learn within Python, I think it's so important, because within any coding language, including Python, there is just so much you can do that if you try and do it all at once, or if you're not sure sort of what area you're interested in, it can very quickly lead down into a rabbit hole, and you're just sort of aimlessly learning different things, which isn't a bad thing, but I think it's much more effective, given that there is so much to learn within each realm, should we say, that if you know sort of what you want to do with coding, it's always very helpful. Even if it's just a hobby, knowing, for example, whether you want to do competitive programming versus whether you're more interested in building websites. Even if you're using Python to code both, they will be sort of very, very different, and you'll need different skill sets to do them. Sort of at the start, this wasn't something that was clear to me. I learned coding as a means to improve processes at my job, and as data becomes more available, not just at my company, but across companies in general, I think knowing how to code will be an invaluable skill. And so anyway, I digress. So another purpose of sort of creating this YouTube channel will also be to sort of cover some of the fundamentals of Python that are necessary to do virtually anything. So just to give you guys a bit more of a flavor around how I started off coding. So I remember roughly a year ago, the project that I was working on for my team involved some very repetitive tasks in terms of filling out Excel sheets and also checking whether certain errors took place relating to alphanumeric characters. And it was from there I knew that there should be a way to sort of automate this process because it seemed very repetitive and quite straightforward. There weren't too many decisions that needed to be taken, so it's either a yes or a no type of thing. And so from there, I really looked into Python or coding, and then I found it quite interesting. Having read for a degree in maths at university, sort of this idea of using logic to solve problems was very appealing. And so I bought a Python book from Amazon. I believe it was Python for Everyone. And I started learning. So from that experience, I would advise that learning from a book, even though it is quite instructive, it's not quite the same as coding or practicing problems and coding. That's much more valuable than learning theory from a book, which is kind of what I think if you read for a CS degree at university, that's really what you do. You learn theories and how the syntax of code works. But when it comes to solving actual problems, it's a completely different thing. Even though you use what you learned, which can be learned quite quickly, I think sort of the thought process behind it's very different. And so again, I am getting off topic, but so that's kind of where I started coding. It was from sort of my job wanting to improve a certain process where I work, and then from there picking up a book, a Python book, and then really just looking online at different tutorials and getting resources from different places. It was quite a tough journey in terms of moving along and sort of understanding what I needed to do to move on to the next step and improve my knowledge in a certain area. And so I think having a video that covers all of that would have been very, very useful to me. And so I think I will include that in this video, and anyone starting up, sort of wanting to learn Python, this will be a very good resource in terms of finding everything that you need. Now, I obviously won't cover all the contents, but I will recommend sort of the books, and other things that you need. For example, it would have been very useful to know what an IDE is. So the IDE that I use is PyCharm. So an IDE is sort of a place where you can code and run your code with inputs that you enter in. Knowing how it works and using it is very useful. And also just getting around finding different problem sets. So I started on a website called Code Wars. So you can create a profile on Code Wars, and different problems are ranked between 1 and 8, 8 being the easiest problem and 1 being the most difficult problems. So different people from the community come up with problems, and there's new problems that come up every day, lots of them. And as a community, I think there's moderators who rank them from 1 to 8. And if you're starting up, obviously you want to tackle the level 8 questions, the easiest ones. But it gives you a real flavor around what coding is really like. And one of the mistakes that I made is that I went into too much theory. So I read books upon books. I looked at tutorial after tutorial, sort of learning what different things you can do within Python, which is useful, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the stuff you don't actually end up using. Whereas when you start solving problems, you see what the useful things are, and you can read more around them. And I think that's a really important lesson that I wish somebody would have told me sooner. And I did watch it on a video later on, but had I known that from the beginning, I could have saved myself a lot of time. So the number one advice I would give is start coding problems as soon as possible. Obviously, you might not be able to do that from the beginning because you do need to know some of the fundamentals of what coding actually involves and sort of how to lay out your code, which isn't too difficult. And I reckon that will be sort of my starting video in terms of the teaching side of things. I'll start with all the fundamentals that you need, and then from that you can use it and apply it to solving problems. And then once you get into problems, well, this was my experience. Once I started solving problems, I naturally became more and more curious in terms of well, one, solving harder problems, and two, looking at how to improve the solutions of my problems so that next time I can use similar ideas to solve harder problems. And I think getting started with solving problems really kickstarted that momentum. And I think for anyone trying to learn coding, that's the number one thing you should do. Learn the basics as fast as possible, which doesn't take very long, and then start straight away with coding problems. Because it will give you an idea, a very, very good idea of what you need to do in order to code. That's kind of how I started coding, is solving these problems on Code Wars. And then it was really from there that I looked at competitive coding. As I got better with Code Wars, sort of solving problems on Code Wars, and I was able to solve them faster and faster, I thought, having watched a number of sort of coding videos, competitive coding is something that came up, where you're basically timed in terms of how fast you can solve a problem, but also, and that can mean a lot of things, how fast you can solve a problem. That could, on the one hand, it means how fast you write the code. On the other hand, it means your code itself, how long it takes to process all the data and give the correct answer. Also, I've built my own personal blog using Python's Flask, which is it's like an extension that you use to build websites. And like I mentioned before, when you use Python for different purposes, it's very different. Like when you solve problems on coding contests, you wouldn't use Flask. You would use logic and data structures to solve your problems. Whereas when you use Python to code websites, you would use Flask and other Python extensions. But what links the two together is the fundamentals of Python. Things like Python syntax. So an analogy might be, if you want to learn a language, you need to learn its characters and how words are put together. And sort of it's using this logic of how words and sentences are put together that you can apply it to different fields. But within those different fields, you'll need to know an entirely different new set of skills or things. And so it's very important once you've learned the basics of Python, that you decide sort of where you what you want to use Python for, because based on that decisions, it will lead you down a very different avenue. And so because those avenues are so deep, you really want to know what you want to do with Python, and then you can get really good at doing that certain thing. So what is coding? And when I speak to different people from different walks of life, I am sometimes surprised that people don't know what coding is. Now, when you traditionally think about coding from somebody who doesn't code, you would think that it's writing a bunch of instructions on a computer, but not much beyond that. And so I wanted to just briefly cover what coding in a nutshell is. So writing code involves essentially taking a bunch of inputs and then processing them. And when I say processing, I mean your code will do something to that input and then returning something else as an output. So for example, let's say you had 50,000 individual sheets of paper or electronic pages, let's say on a Word document, and you wanted to scan through all of it, and you wanted to pick out all the words with the alphabet A, for example. It would take you a very long time to sort of go through the 50,000 documents manually and pick out all the words with the alphabet A, even though it's possible. But to put it in a coding context, the input would be the 50,000 pages. And the process, what your code is going to write, is to pick out all of the words with the letter A. And your output is all of the words with the letter A. So I think that's a very easy example, but it makes it very clear sort of what the idea of coding is, where you're writing a set of instructions that takes usually a very big input and does some processing to it, and returns an output that otherwise would have taken you very long to do manually or would have been very repetitive. Because computing is very powerful, it's able to sort of process this. And so the first video that I'll do is cover some of the fundamentals of Python that you need to know. So I'll start off with the installations, what you should get, maybe what some of the books that I would recommend that you read. And then I will also do a set of 3 or 4 videos covering the actual fundamentals of Python. And I'll provide examples of how to use these ideas to code out problems.